I'd like to welcome you to this public meeting of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board. This is just one meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine renewal lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2019, and on or before September 30th, 2020. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Shayla Garcia. Present. Leah Goodridge. Cecilia Hossa.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Herman Tejeda. Scott Walsh.
Present.
May Yu. David Reese. Present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. City Hall is in the process of filling the owner vacancy, and we hope to have a new member in the near future. In your folders, you will find copies of the 2019 Price Index of Operating Cost and the 2019 Mortgage Survey Report that will be presented at today's meeting. For the past several years, staff has prepared historical data tables for the members of the RGB prior to the preliminary vote. These tables were distributed to the board prior to today's meeting, and copies are in your folder. After the presentation of the RGB reports, we have a guest speaker from the New York State Homes and Community Renewal, Deputy Commissioner for the Office of Rent Administration, Woody Pascal. Our next meeting will be here on April 25th, starting at 9:30 a.m., and is tenant-owner invited group testimony day. Owner and tenant members should get your list of speakers to Andrew by April 22nd. As stated on our schedule, speakers representing apartment tenants are scheduled for the morning session, and apartment owner representatives are scheduled to begin at 1 p.m. Hotel tenant testimony begins at 3 p.m., followed by hotel owners at 3:45 p.m. The preliminary vote for rent-stabilized renewal lease adjustments has been finalized and now will be held on May 7th at the Great Hall, Cooper Union, 7 East 7th Street in Manhattan, starting at 7 p.m. The final vote is scheduled for June 25th at the same location and at the same time. There are copies of the most current 2019 meeting schedule in your folders, and it can also be found on our website, nyc.gov/RGB. Copies of our schedule are here today. Please note that the public hearings are being finalized and will be released to the public shortly. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please take one of our flyers that are here today, or you can sign up by going to the board's new homepage at nyc.gov/RGB. Please note that the annual filing of the Conflicts of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report filing period has begun. The filing period will end May 3rd, 2019. Packets for new members have been recently generated, and if you have not received yours, please see Charmaine. I will now introduce Andrew, who will be presenting the 2019 Price Index of Operating Costs. Please note that there are copies of this report here today, and it will be made available on our website after the meeting.
Yeah, and just a couple of notes. One, in the recording of the last meeting, there were times when the mics weren't on, so if you want to keep it on all the time, that's fine, but if you'd rather just turn it on and off, just make sure you turn it on when you speak. The other thing is that the current schedule will be updated this afternoon, including the May 7th and May 16th meetings on our website. Currently, it just has on our website through next week's meeting, but we'll update that after the meeting. The dates that are on our site are correct, yeah, but we only had it through the 25th. But on your sheet, the dates are correct. Yeah, and we can discuss the schedule a little later, toward the end of the meeting. So David, while we're waiting, do you want to just talk about the schedule a little bit? Just updates?
I'm happy to, but I'm not sure what you have in mind. Just
Yeah, no, just that it's May 7th, obviously, is the preliminary vote now. There'll be 4 hearings instead of 5 hearings this year, 1 in Manhattan instead of 2. And in your folders, you have a draft schedule of the hearing dates. We were in the process of maybe trying to find another venue for the Manhattan hearing. I know we had some issues with the air conditioning last year, so we were trying to find a new space if we can, unless they can assure us so it would be up and running. So there's a couple of venues that we're checking out. So as soon as we know a venue, we'll let you guys know and go from there. But, so that's the update on the schedule. But the dates that are on there, I believe the Bronx hearing will be June 11th. Brooklyn hearing will be June 13th. June 18th is the one in Queens, and then the Manhattan hearing would be June 20th. So, yeah, they're pretty much set, especially because the venues are starting to we're starting to lose days in the venues. So the Queens is the Queens is definitely set. We can't switch that one, I know. And Brooklyn is pretty much set as well for the 13th. So. So if you have any questions, all right. Maybe if you. So I think we're going to invest in one of those overhead slide projectors, the old-fashioned type that you turn on, the light bulb comes on, and put the transparent screen on there. Oh, well. Anyway, sorry for the delay. It's going to present the 2019 Price Index of Operating Costs. The New York City Rent Guidelines Board Price Index of Operating Costs gathers prices for a market basket of goods and services used in the operation and maintenance of rent-stabilized buildings in New York City, and uses these prices to estimate cost and price changes from one year to the next. Changes in the overall PIOC result from changes in the prices of individual goods and services, each weighted by its relative importance as a percentage of the total O&M expenditures. This is the same approach used by the Consumer Price Index and other similar indices. But the PIOC specifically analyzes the goods and services typically purchased by owners of buildings containing rent-stabilized units. In order to reflect the current expenditure patterns, and for the 5th consecutive year, RGB staff used the expenditure patterns presented in the most current income and expense study to update the component weights for the 2019 apartment index. This year, the PIOC for all rent-stabilized apartment buildings increased by 5.5%, 2.1 percentage points higher than last year's 2019 projection of 3.4%. Increases occurred in all PIOC components, with the greatest proportional increase in the fuel component, which increased 13.8%. The growth in the Consumer Price Index, or CPI, during the same time period was less than the PIOC, rising 1.9%. The core PIC rose by 4.9%, and we'll get into a little bit later what the core price index is. And the PIC is projected to be 3.2% in 2020. So here's an overview of all the changes in the apartment PIOC, which I will go into detail shortly about each of these components. Increases occurred in all of the components. Notably, fuel increased 13.8%, which again is the greatest proportional increase in this year's PIOC, and taxes increased 7.1%. Increases were seen in the remaining 5 components that range from 0.4% to 6%. These changes in costs resulted in a total increase of 5.5%. So the PIOC is comprised of weights and price relatives. So in the PIOC, we identify prices for various items that are represented of the operating costs for apartment buildings in New York City. So the importance of these items in calculating the PIOC is what we call its weight. And this should be based on how much owners have spent in the past for a category of each expense. The change in price or cost is referred to as a price relative. So 6 years ago, we started using RPIE data because an analysis concluded that the data in the I&E or the weights in the I&E should be used as a basis for the rent-stabilized apartment PIOC component weights. Simply, they were more current and they were owner-reported. We first implemented this change for 2015 PIOC, and we've used it in every PIOC since. So for this year's price index, the component weights reflect the actual cost reported by owners in 2017, which is the most current data available. And they replace weights that were more than 30 years old and are considered more accurate representation of owners' expenditure patterns. So up to 2015, we were using weights that were determined in the early 80s and updated each year, but this is, with our analysis in 2015, we realized that using the weights from the I&E was the way to go. Unfortunately, the RPIE data is not used to calculate the hotel and loft indices. The data is specific to apartments. So we wouldn't have enough data for us to reweight for these two indices, so we still use the old weighting pattern for those. So it's also interesting to know where we actually get the data for the price index. So there's basically 4 different data sources we get from government agencies, vendors and contractors, unions and utility companies, and owners of rent-stabilized buildings. So you can see from this slide that only 18% of the data that we use are reported by owners. And the remainder comes from either government agencies, the vendors and contractors directly, or we go to unions and utility companies for the remaining change in costs and price. So now I'm going to go into each component. We're going to start with real estate taxes. The real estate tax component of the price index is the largest component and in fact represents about 30% of owners' costs. This year, taxes rose 7.1%, driven largely by the rise in assessments. The slide shows a breakdown in the change of assessments and exemptions by borough. Assessed valuations of properties containing stabilized units rose by 9.1% citywide in fiscal year 2019. Assessments rose in all 5 boroughs, with the Bronx witnessing the highest growth at 12.5%, followed by Brooklyn at 11.8%, Staten Island at 11%, and both Queens and Manhattan at 8.5%. Buildings in Manhattan account for much of the change in assessed value, the total assessed value citywide. Again, this was true in fiscal year 29 when 61% of the total assessed value was attributed to Manhattan. The large majority of the rent-stabilized multifamily properties are in Class 2. There was a decrease in the Class 2 tax rate of 0.8% from fiscal year 2018 to fiscal year 2019, falling in each of the 5 boroughs. And at the same time, exemptions lowered the overall tax burden by 1.2%. As a result, the rise in assessments was offset by a rise in the total value of exemptions and a decrease in the tax rate, which had the effect of lowering the total rise in taxes, resulting in an overall increase of 7.1%. So if you look at the changes historically, you can disaggregate the tax into several different components. The black line on the chart on the slide represents the change in taxes from one year to the next. This year, the change was 7.1%. The change can be broken down into impact in assessments, which is the orange bar, and the impact of exemptions, abatements, and changes in the tax rate, which are grouped together in the maroon bar. The change in taxes was primarily due, as you can see, by the rise in assessments of 9.1% this past fiscal year. Exemptions lowered the overall rise in taxes, as did the lowering of the tax rate. It is interesting to note that since 2001, the increase in real estate taxes have more often than not been driven by the rise in assessments, and since 2011, almost entirely by assessments.
So we are looking at, so the data overall that we're looking at when you talk about the change is from 2017?
No, the change that we're talking about is from fiscal year 2018 to fiscal year 2019. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the labor cost component. The labor costs include both union and non-union salaries and benefits, in addition to Social Security and unemployment insurance. The cost of unionized labor makes up about 2/3 of the labor cost component, and the entire labor cost component comprises about 15.7% of the overall price index. Labor costs rose 6%, 2.8 percentage points higher than last year's rise of 3.2%. The rise in labor costs was primarily due to increases in non-union wages, as well as rising costs in health care. An increase in unemployment insurance of 8.2% had minimal impact, since it accounts for less than 0.5% of this component's weight. Wages comprise 3/4 of the labor cost component. Non-union pay increased by 5.7%, and unionized wages also rose, rising 2.2%, a combined 2.2%. Health and welfare benefits, which comprise more than 21% of the labor cost component, increased 14.7%. And it should be noted that the rise in health and welfare benefits was underestimated in PIOCs from 2016, 2017, and 2018. And so to compensate this underestimate was applied to this year's PIOC. So it had the effect of rising, making up the difference over that period of time. If the underestimate wasn't there, labor costs would have actually risen 4.1% instead of the 6%. And the overall PISC would have been 5.2% instead of 5.5%. So the fuel component comprises about 6.9% of this year's price index. The change in cost measured in this component considers both the change in weather and the change in prices for heating multifamily buildings by fuel oil, natural gas, and steam. This year, the fuel component increased 13.8%. The cost of heating buildings by gas makes up almost half of this component. Gas costs increased 14.7%. Fuel oil costs, which account for about 44% of this component, also rose, increasing 14.4%. Steam costs rose 4.9%, but these costs only account for roughly 8% of the fuel component. So just to break down, to take a look at the impact of weather on prices. So along with measuring price, the PISC also takes into account the effect of weather and the demand as a result, and the demand for fuel, especially during the heating season when the large majority of fuel is burned. Since the weather this year was colder than last year, the increase in fuel cost was greater than it would have been if prices alone were considered. So for instance, over the past 12 months, fuel oil prices, which do not take weather into account, increased by 9.4%. The price for number 2 fuel oil, which comprises about 28% of this component, rose 10.3%. Prices for number 4 oil, which comprises 16% of this component, also rose, increasing 7.8%. cost increased at a greater rate than the pure price because the weather was 4.6% colder than the prior year, indicating more heating was needed. The next component is the utilities component, and it consists of non-heating natural gas and electricity costs, as well as water and sewer charges, and makes up about 10% of this year's price index. This year, utilities increased by 0.4%. Non-heating electricity costs, which account for over a quarter of the weight in this component, decreased by 5.2%. Non-heating electricity costs, which account for over a quarter of the weight in this component, rose 10.2%. The growth in this component was primarily fueled by water and sewer, which increased 2.4% and makes up 72% of the utilities component. The maintenance costs component, or the maintenance component, includes painting and other services performed by contractors, hardware and cleaning items, and appliances that need periodic replacement. This component accounts for 17.7% of this year's price index. This year, maintenance costs increased 3.8%. Of the 29 expense items contained in this component, just 4 items account for 51% of its expenditure weight. This year, painters' rates rose 5.7%. The combination of the 2 plumbing items increased 2.6%, and electrician services rose 4.2%. Other price increases of note were boiler repairs, up 5.7%, floor maintenance, almost flat, just up 0.2%, roof repair, up 9.2%, and extermination services, 3.6%. And these items represent a total of 7 expense, these items, and account for over 23% of this component. The administrative costs component is made up of fees paid to management companies, accountants, and attorneys, for the most part, because it makes up about 87% of this component, and it rose 3.5%. A large portion of the growth in the administrative costs component can be attributed to a rise in management company fees of 2.9%. That comprise just over half of this component. Accounting fees increased in this year's PIRC by 4.4%, and attorney fees rose 4.3%. They account for about 35% of the administrative cost component. And communications, which accounts for just over 5% of this component, actually decreased 4.4%. And the final component that makes up the price index is the cost of insurance. For the 8th consecutive year, there was an increase in the insurance cost component, rising 6%, compared to last year's increase of 3.3%. Insurance costs account for about 5% of the price index. Changes in insurance costs by owners varied by the amount of the policy. Policies that cost more than $6,338, which represent half of all verified insurance quotes, saw an increase in the cost of 6.4% upon renewal. And meanwhile, buildings with policies of $6,338 or less saw an increase of 3.6%. So the larger the amount of the policy, the higher the increase this year. So that's the all apartments index. We're also able to break out the indices by age, building age, and by whether they're heated by gas or oil heated. This was derived from the 1983 expenditure study, which provided a basis for calculating separate sets of expenditure weights for different types of buildings that contain rent-stabilized units. So in addition to the price index for all stabilized apartment, the PIRC includes separate indices for buildings constructed before 1947 or pre-1947, and for buildings constructed in 1947 or later, post-1946, as well as for gas-heated and oil-heated buildings. So typically, pre-1947 buildings incur a lower percentage of operating and maintenance costs for property taxes and labor costs than post-46 buildings. However, fuel costs for heating pre-47 buildings represent a significantly higher percentage of total operating and maintenance costs. As a result, total costs in the pre-47 index rose by 5.7%, while costs in the post-46 index rose by a lesser amount, 5.1%. Again, indices were also calculated for different types of heating systems. These heating system indices differ from the price index for all apartments because the expenditure weight for the fuel component differs from index to index. Because the fuel component carries more weight in oil-heated buildings versus those heated by gas, the oil-heated index rose 5.8%, more than the gas-heated index, which actually rose slightly less by 5.5%. So now I'm going to move into the price index for all stabilized hotels. The price index for all rent-stabilized hotels increased 5.5% this year, a 1.6 percentage point difference from the 3.9% rise in 2018, and it's the same as the all apartments index this year. This year, there were increases in all 7 of the PIRC hotel components. The fuel component witnessed the highest increase, rising 13.8%. The fuel component accounts for just over 15% of the entire hotel index. The remaining 6 component witnessed more moderate cost increases, with insurance costs rising 6%, real estate taxes rising 4.9%, labor costs 4.4%, maintenance 2.4%, administrative costs 1.8%, and utilities 1.5%. The hotel price index also includes separate indices for each of the 3 categories of rent-stabilized hotels due to dissimilar operating cost profiles, as well as general index for all stabilized hotels. The 3 categories of hotels are traditional hotels, rooming houses, and SROs. Among the different categories of hotels, the index for traditional hotels increased 4.7%, rooming houses by 6.2%, and SROs by 6.4%. We also have a price index for lofts, which rose 6.2% this year, 1 percentage point higher than the 5.2% increase in 2018. Increases in costs were seen in all 8 components that make up this index. Fuel costs witnessed the highest rate increase, 13.7%. More moderate increases were seen in taxes of 7.1%, labor costs 6.4%, insurance costs 6%, administrative costs legal 4.3%, administrative costs other 3.2%, maintenance and 4.1%, and utilities 1.6%. Note that historically, administrative costs and loft index has been split into 2 components, administrative costs legal and administrative costs other. Therefore, the loft index has 8 components as opposed to 7. We also do something called the core price index. And the core PIRC rose 4.9% in 2019. This index measures long-term trends by factoring out shifts in fuel costs for heating rent-stabilized buildings in New York City. The rise in the 2019 core PIRC was 0.6 percentage points lower than this year's apartment index, which was 5.5%, but 1.2 percentage points higher than last year's core index. The core PIRC rose at a slower pace than the overall PIRC because fuel costs, which were not used to calculate the core PIRC, increased 13.8%. Projections for the components of the PIRC are performed to provide the rent guidelines with an estimate of how much costs are expected to rise in the year following the current price index. Last year, projected PIRC increase was 3.4%, which was 2.1 percentage points off from the 5.5% measured in this year's price index. The component with the largest deviation between actual and projected changes in costs was fuel. Fuel was projected to rise just 1.1%, but actually rose 13.8% in 2019, a 12.7 percentage point difference. So overall, the PIRC is expected to grow by 3.2% from 2019 to 2020. Costs are predicted to rise in each component except fuel, with the largest growth, 5.7%, projected to be in insurance, with taxes, the component that creates the most weight in the index, close behind at 5.6%. Other projected increases include labor costs, 3.5%, maintenance, 3.3%, administrative costs, 2.8%, and utilities, 1.4%. Fuel is the only component predicted to decrease, and that's predicted to go down by 6.9%. The core PIRC is projected to rise 3.9%, 0.7 percentage points more than the overall projected apartment PIRC. It is important to note that the changes in costs and prices after March 2019, the last month covered by this study, will be measured in next year's price index. Which leads us now to the commensurate rent adjustment. So each year, the board is obligated to formulate guidelines, and the law only gives very general criteria, i.e. the board considers mortgage financing, income and expense data, tenant income and housing affordability, the price index, and other factors in setting the guidelines. One tool the board has used since its inception is called the commensurate rent adjustment. What the commensurate rent adjustment determines is how much would rents have to change to keep the NOI, net operating income, constant for owners of a rent-stabilized building. In other words, if that NOI was, say, $40 and the income was $100, how much would rents have to change to keep that NOI at $40 in absolute fixed dollars? How much would rents have to be adjusted to keep the NOI figure constant or at the same absolute number? The first commensurate method is called the net revenue approach. While the formula takes into consideration the term of leases actually signed by tenants, it does not adjust owner's NOI for inflation. The net revenue formula is presented in two ways. First, adjusting for the mix of lease terms, and second, adding an assumption of rent-stabilized apartment turnover and the impact of revenue from vacancy increases. So under the net revenue formula, a guideline that would preserve NOI in the face of this year's 5.5% increase in the price index is 4% for a one-year lease and 8% for a two-year lease. Using this formula and adding assumptions for the impact of vacancy increases on revenues when apartments experience turnover results in guidelines of 3% for one-year leases and 3% for one-year lease and two-year lease, 5.25% for two-year leases. For the commensurate formulas that include a vacancy assumption, a 10.5% median increase in vacancy leases calculated from the HCR 2018 apartment registration file was used. The second commensurate method considers a mix of lease terms while adjusting NOI upward to reflect general inflation, keeping both operating maintenance costs and NOI constant. This is commonly called the CPI Adjusted NOI formula. A guideline that would preserve NOI in the face of the 1.9% increase in the CPI and the 5.5% increase in the price index is 4.75% for one-year lease and 9.25% for two-year leases. Guidelines using this formula and adding the estimated impact of vacancy increases are 3.75% for one-year leases and 6.75% for two-year leases. The third commensurate method The traditional commencement adjustment is a formula that has been used since the inception of the Rent Guidelines Board and is the only method that relies on the PIRC projection. The traditional commensurate yields 3.6% for a one-year lease and 4.7% for a two-year lease. This reflects the increase in operating costs of 5.5% found in the 2019 price index and the projection of a 3.2% increase next year. And, each of these formulae may be best thought of as a starting point for deliberations. The data presented in other Rent Guidelines Board annual research reports, such as the Income and Affordability Study or the Income and Expense Study, along with the public testimony, can be used in conjunction with these various commensurates to determine appropriate rent adjustments. So just a quick summary of what we discussed. The price index for all apartment buildings rose 5.5%. Costs in gas-heated buildings, 5.5%. Oil-heated buildings, 5.8%. The core PISC rose 4.9% this year. Hotel index rose 5.5%. The loft index rose 6.2%. And the price index of operating costs for rent-stabilized apartment buildings is projected to increase 3.2% next year. And that's that.
Andrew,
So-
could you maybe present the pros and cons of the different commensurates for the board members, the arguments that people would make on each sides for them, so people can get some more context?
Sure. So the traditional commensurate, which actually is the last one we talk about, was around since the inception of the board back in, I think, 1968, 69, well, 69. So I guess the first commensurate was done in 1969. And essentially, it takes the price index and our projection. So what it's doing is compensating owners for 1 year for those signing 1-year leases for the expenses that we measured in the price index. The second 2-year lease is taking our projection and compensating owners for that, for the next year. So that's what the traditional formula does. It doesn't take the mix of term leases into effect, meaning the number of people signing 1-year leases or 2-year leases, nor does it take into account inflation that would impact NOI. So essentially, it's taking the cost of the O&M costs, percentage of costs, multiplying it by our 1-year lease guideline. So you come up with 3.6% for a 1-year lease, and it's doing a similar thing with some adjustment to that, and coming up with a 4.7%. So some of the commensurate's relying on a projection that we're not always right about. So that's one of the flaws, and it doesn't take in the exact mixed term of leases, nor does it account for inflation on the NOI side of the dollar. So then there's two other commensurates that we came up with in the 90s. Staff devised these two. The first one just takes into account the mixed term of leases. So we're saying a certain number of people are signing 1-year leases every year. Certain percentage are signing 2-year leases. Certain percentage of tenants aren't signing any lease because they're on the second year of a 2-year lease. So when you factor that in, you have 1-year lease guideline of 4% and 2-year lease guideline of 8%. And essentially, you're asking for the renewal lease folks to cover expenses that occurred in the price index for that particular year. You're not projecting forward. The projection's not used for that. So who's ever signing a 1 or 2-year lease, you're compensating for owner expense over that, the current 12-month period. We also include in here a vacancy factor because there's a certain percentage that sign vacancy leases that give you a different increase. Not our renewal adjustments don't impact that. So when you factor that in, it generally has the effect of lowering what each one of those renewal lease signers would have to do to compensate owners. So that's why it's less than the first one. So the vacancy factor always will lower those guidelines. So that's what this does. But there is inflation, so we're saying, so for that NOI to actually be maintained from year to year, we have to take in whether the actual, the impact of the dollar, of inflation on the dollar. So we want to make sure these formulas are designed to have owners keep their NOI the same from year to year. So the next one is where we adjust the portion of the dollar by the CPI, which was this year 1.9%. So it's taking in the mixed term of leases and also the CPI. So we're taking that 5.5% of the price index and then we're inflating the dollar by that amount for the expense portion of the dollar. What's the NOI portion of the dollar? We then take the 1.9% and add on to that. That's why these guidelines are generally higher than the net revenue. And then once you factor in vacancy, it will dampen.
Andrew, does the model assume that the building is 100% rent stabilized? So, for instance, does the model play out differently in a building that was like 20% rent stabilized versus 80%? Or what is the assumption about the building?
It doesn't take into the assumption of the building. You got to look at these as individual units. So you're taking that individual unit and keeping the NOI whole for that particular unit. So that's what it's sort of designed to do. It doesn't take into account revenue from deregulated units.
So just so I understand, so that's why NOI could be increasing even if the RGB adopted increase is smaller than the NOI increase.
Well, yeah, but that's not just true on the deregulated units, but also on the stabilized units, because there's other ways that owners can increase on the stabilized units as well.
Right, got it.
Right, so that doesn't factor that. It doesn't factor in MCI or IAI, and it doesn't factor in. The deregulated units, some years they're going to bring in less income because they're subject to the market, and some years they may bring in more income, than the stabilized, or I shouldn't say more income, but the increases would be higher some years than the regulated, and in some years lower because it's the market. So we don't factor that in. Basically, you sort of have to look this on as an individual, like you're maintaining that NOI per apartment, but we don't factor in MCI or IAI. I think the board tries to do that with other data sources and with the information that we know what's going on with those two types of increases. Preferential rents, it doesn't also, if they're giving increases higher than our renewal adjustments because it's below the legal amount, that's not considered either. So, but again, the board, I think, considers that, or can certainly consider that as well.
I would welcome comments or questions from the board for Andrew or just to put out there for our deliberations.
Yeah, a couple of questions just from my understanding. So the one-year increases are based on the previous year's change in the price index, correct?
Yeah, it would be the 12-month period from April to March is what we measure. So it's the most current data that we have about the expense.
And is CPI, are you projecting change in CPI? So when you're looking forward for a year or 2 years, what inflation index are you using? Is it based on, again, the previous year, or are you using a projection?
No, we use what was that over that 12-month. We're using the same time period as the price index.
Okay.
So we measure the CPI from
the previous 12 months.
April to March.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions or comments from the board? No? Okay. Should we move on to our next presentation?
Yes. I do not see HCR here, so we might as well just move on.